She was 32, a virgin, a dance teacher in a quiet coastal town who had never been kissed by love, only touched by longing. Until one night, her phone lit up with a message from the only man who had ever truly seen her. Not a lover, not even someone she had spoken to in years, just her childhood best friend, now a powerful millionaire. And what he asked? It wasn't about romance, it was about trust, about legacy, about creating a child, together. Not because of love, but because of something deeper. What kind of woman agrees to carry a child for a man she's never been with? And what kind of man dares to ask? This isn't a love story that begins with passion. It begins with choice. And what happens next will rewrite everything you think you know about friendship, love, and what it means to truly belong to someone, soul first. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments where are you listening from. Your like helps this channel grow and continue bringing more emotional stories like this one. Share it with someone special. Charlotte Hayes had always lived a quiet, intentional life. At 32, she was still a virgin, not out of fear or repression, but because her heart had never truly been called by anyone. Her days unfolded in rhythm with the music of her dance studio in the modest town of Portview, a place where the sea whispered through alleyways and mornings smelled of fresh bread and salt. She wasn't famous, she wasn't rich, but she had peace, and for a long time that had been enough, until his message arrived. It came in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon. Her phone buzzed as she adjusted the music for her students' warm-up routine. A simple text on a screen from a name she hadn't seen in years, but one that still lived quietly in a hidden corner of her chest. Lucas Bennett. Can we talk? I have something important to ask. 10 words. Just 10. But they undid something inside her. Charlotte froze, her fingers trembling slightly as she reread it. Lucas, the boy who once sat beside her at the harbor, mapping out imaginary sea routes on napkins. The boy who became the man now appearing on magazine covers, the enigmatic CEO of Bennett Logistics. Powerful, private, intimidatingly successful. They hadn't seen each other in almost 7 years. That night, they met at the Lighthouse Cafe, their old spot. Small, rustic, with peeling paint and the kind of charm only a coastal town could love. The place hadn't changed. But Lucas had. He stood as she entered, tall and composed, but the moment their eyes met, she saw it. The flicker of something vulnerable behind the confidence. The man who had once been her best friend. "Hi, Char," he said softly, and just like that, her childhood nickname unlocked 1,000 memories. "Hi, Lucas." They didn't rush. They never did. Conversation moved slowly, carefully, like the tide. They spoke of the past, of Portview, of his mother now living in Florence, of her injured knee that ended her ballet career. They laughed, they paused, but something in him was holding back, and she felt it. After their meals were cleared, Lucas leaned forward, elbows resting on the weathered wood of the table. "I didn't ask you here just to catch up." Charlotte's breath caught. "I want to have a child," he said, his voice steady, deliberate. She blinked, unsure if she had heard him right. "Wills what?" "I want to become a father," he clarified, "and I want it to be with you." The words hung in the air like fog, dense, inescapable. Charlotte stared at him, waiting for a smile, a laugh, some indication that this was a joke. But Lucas wasn't joking. "I've thought about this for a long time," he continued. "I know it's unconventional. I know it's not what you'd expect. But I'm not asking for marriage or romance. I'm asking because you're the only person I trust with something this real." Her fingers curled around her glass. "Lucas, I haven't seen you in years." "And yet," he said softly, "you still feel like home." She looked away. Her pulse raced. "Why not adopt? Or date someone and build that together?" "I've dated," he said, with a hint of sadness. "Models, actresses, CEOs, but no one gets me. No one sees past the man in the suit. You always did. You were there when my father died. You stayed when everyone else left. You danced for me that night I couldn't breathe from grief. You held me together." His voice trembled. Charlotte's throat tightened. "But Lucas, I've never..." "I know," he said gently. "I know about your choice. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm asking you because of who you are." Silence fell between them. The ocean outside echoed in the distance. Wind danced with the hanging lanterns, and for a moment it felt like time had folded in on itself, like they were 16 again, hiding in the library after school, whispering dreams they never thought would matter. Charlotte exhaled slowly. So what would this look like exactly? Co-parenting? No, he said, his eyes sincere. Something deeper. I want to raise this child with you. Together. Whatever form it takes, I want it to be honest. No lies, no pretenses. 1,000 thoughts spiraled through her mind. This wasn't just a proposal. It was a mirror reflecting everything she had buried. Her longing for family, her hidden grief at never being truly chosen, her quiet, growing fear that she might live her whole life untouched by something extraordinary. She stood from the table. "I need time." "Of course," he said without hesitation. "I didn't expect an answer tonight." They stepped outside into the night. The sky was velvet black, scattered with stars. The wind carried the scent of salt and driftwood. Charlotte hugged her coat around her, unsure if the cold came from outside or within. Lucas walked her to her car. He didn't push, didn't plead. He simply looked at her with the quiet intensity that had always disarmed her, like he could see parts of her she tried to hide from herself. As she opened the door, he said, "I'm not asking you to fall in love with me, Charlotte. I'm asking you to trust the part of us that never stopped mattering." She didn't answer. She couldn't. That night, in her small apartment, she sat in silence. No music, no distractions. Just the weight of the proposal and the echo of a voice that had once been her anchor. Could she say yes? Could she really carry a child for someone she once loved in silence? Could she step into the unknown, not for romance, but for something that might be even harder? Truth. She didn't sleep. But sometime around 4 a.m., as dawn began to bleed through the window and the world slowly returned to life, one thought rose above the fear. What if everything I've been waiting for is already inside this impossible question? Long before Lucas Bennett became a name whispered in boardrooms and printed on glossy magazine covers, he was just a boy with 2 large shoes and salt in his hair, the kind of boy who studied the shape of ships before he ever understood the shape of his own heart. And Charlotte Hayes? She was the girl next door who always smelled faintly of vanilla and books, who danced barefoot on sidewalks and memorized poetry like prayers. They met when they were 8 years old. It was a Saturday, late spring. Charlotte had been sitting alone on a bench outside the Portview Library, hugging a worn copy of The Secret Garden to her chest, waiting for her grandmother to pick her up. Lucas approached, hands stuffed in the pockets of his cargo shorts, dragging a toy ship behind him on a string. He didn't say hello. He just sat beside her and said, "You look like you believe in magic." She turned, caught off guard. "And you look like you want to live on a boat." He grinned. "I do." From that moment, something quiet and irrevocable settled between them. Portview wasn't a glamorous town. It was small, weathered, with peeling paint and wind-bent trees. But to them it was everything. After school they met at the harbour, where Charlotte practiced turns and plies on the wooden docks, while Lucas sketched out shipping routes in the sand with a stick. He'd talk about engines and tides and cargo weights, while she corrected his posture and told him that even captains needed balance. Their worlds couldn't have been more different. Charlotte lived with her grandmother in a modest apartment above a florist's shop. Her father had died when she was 3, and her mother had disappeared soon after, swallowed by addiction and regret. Her grandmother, a retired ballet teacher with silver hair and fierce eyes, raised her with discipline, kindness, and an unwavering belief in dreams. Lucas, on the other hand, was the only son of Edward Bennett, founder of Bennett Logistics and the wealthiest man in town. He lived in a cliffside estate that looked more like a museum than a home. But it was always cold there, always quiet. His mother rarely smiled, and his father's voice echoed more often in anger than affection. Charlotte was the warmth he didn't have, the place he could be messy, small, uncertain. They became inseparable. While other kids played video games or went to the mall, Charlotte and Lucas built imaginary empires from library books and tide charts. She taught him how to listen, to music, to silence, to feelings. He taught her how to dream bigger, to imagine stages in Paris and studios in New York. But even as they grew older, their differences became more visible. By 13, Lucas was being groomed for succession. He wore suits to dinner and sat through meetings with men who measured his worth by numbers. Charlotte, meanwhile, danced in worn-out slippers and walked to school with hand-me-down backpacks. People noticed, some even whispered. But the two of them never let it matter, until it did. At 16, Lucas lost his father. The news came on a grey morning in December. His father's private yacht had capsized during a winter storm off the Atlantic coast. The town mourned publicly. But behind the gated estate, Lucas's mother collapsed into silence. She left for Europe 2 months later, leaving Lucas alone with lawyers, board members, and a legacy too heavy for any teenager to carry. Everyone stepped back, except Charlotte. She didn't try to fix him. She didn't offer empty words. Instead, she danced. One night when he showed up at her apartment door in the rain, soaked, pale, hollow-eyed, she didn't ask what happened. She simply pulled him inside, set an old jazz record spinning, and danced barefoot in the living room, letting her movement speak where words couldn't. He watched her, shoulders shaking, hands buried in his pockets, until finally he whispered, "Don't leave." "I won't," she said, "even if the whole world does." From that moment on, something shifted. Their friendship wasn't just a childhood bond anymore. It had roots, depth, pain, and unspoken questions. Did they love each other? Yes, but not in ways they could name. Not yet. By 18, the tide pulled them apart. Lucas received a scholarship to Columbia. Business, finance, power. Everyone said it was his destiny. Charlotte, meanwhile, was accepted into a prestigious ballet conservatory in Los Angeles, the kind of place her grandmother had once only dared to dream of for her. Their goodbye was nothing dramatic. No tears at the airport, no promises they couldn't keep. Just a hug, a long one, full of silence and memory. "I'll write," he said. "I'll write back." And they did, at first. Long letters, full of books read, places seen, thoughts explored, emails that grew shorter, video calls that became more infrequent, and slowly, like so many connections born in youth, the rhythm of life pulled them into separate currents. But Charlotte never stopped thinking about him. Sometimes, in the middle of a rehearsal, a certain melody would remind her of the night she danced for him in the rain. Sometimes, when she passed a shipyard or heard a news story about Bennett Logistics, she would pause, wondering what he was doing, whether he was okay, whether he remembered. And Lucas? Lucas never truly filled the silence she left behind. He had lovers, companions, elegant women with sharp smiles, but none of them knew him. Not really. Not the boy who once cried in a dance studio, or the teenager who begged someone to stay. He followed Charlotte's career from a distance, watched her rise, quietly cheered for her, even sent anonymous donations to struggling dance schools in her name. And when he learned about her injury, the torn ligament that ended her career too soon, something in him ached, not out of pity, but recognition. He knew what it was to lose something that shaped you. And so years later, when he heard she had returned to Portview, living once again above the florist's shop, teaching small dance classes to children with bright eyes and messy ponytails, he knew it was time. He had spent years building an empire. But none of it mattered if he couldn't build something real, something that reminded him of who he had been and who he could still become. He didn't know if she would say yes. He didn't even know if she would forgive him for the silence, for the distance. But there was one thing he was certain of. If there was one person in this world who could give him not just a child, but a sense of home, it was Charlotte Hayes. The day the sea took Edward Bennett was the day Lucas stopped believing in safety. It had been an ordinary Friday. Sky clear, waters calm. His father had set sail from Portview for what was supposed to be a routine inspection of a new shipping route. Lucas remembered watching from the cliffside balcony, eyes squinting against the morning sun, as the yacht vanished into the horizon, unaware that it would never return. The storm came from nowhere. By nightfall, waves slammed the coast with ferocity, Winds screamed through the town like an ancient warning, tearing branches from trees and electricity from homes. Lucas sat by the window of his mansion, watching the rain blur the world. He didn't move, didn't cry. He simply waited for news. It came just after midnight. Wreckage had been found, floating crates, a torn flag, pieces of polished mahogany, and finally confirmation. His father's body had been pulled from the icy Atlantic by a Coast Guard vessel just before dawn. Lucas didn't attend the funeral. Couldn't. Instead, he sat in his father's office for hours, surrounded by leather chairs, nautical charts, and the faint scent of whiskey and salt. He stared at the model ship on the mahogany desk, tracing its frame with a shaking finger. The ship they'd built together when he was 10, the last thing they'd done without arguing. That night, his mother collapsed. Not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. She shut down, packed a single suitcase the next week, and left for Florence without so much as a real goodbye. She said she couldn't breathe in that house anymore, couldn't look at him. He looked too much like Edward. So she vanished. And Lucas was left behind with staff who pitied him, board members who watched him like a threat, and an empire that had lost its captain. Everyone gave him space. Everyone gave him silence. Except Charlotte. She didn't knock when she arrived. She didn't even text. She simply appeared at his front door in jeans, a hoodie, and old ballet flats soaked from the rain. Her hair clung to her face, and her cheeks were pink from the cold. When he opened the door, he stared at her like he was dreaming. His eyes were hollow, red-rimmed, his posture slumped like someone who hadn't slept in days. He didn't say a word. Neither did she. She took his hand, rough, cold, and led him inside. Past the sterile hallway, the grand staircase, and into the sunken living room where the fireplace remained unused. She pushed furniture aside, pulled a record from his father's old vinyl collection, and placed it on the player. Soft jazz began to hum. Then she danced. Slowly, barefoot. Not for show. Not to impress. She moved the way she used to when they were kids, with arms like waves, with feet that barely touched the ground, with a heart that knew pain had no language but movement. Lucas watched from the floor, his back against the wall, legs pulled to his chest. At first his face was unreadable, but as the music filled the room and Charlotte's silhouette cut through the shadows like a whisper, his breath broke. His shoulders trembled. And tears, real, human, shattering tears, spilled down his cheeks. He hadn't cried since the announcement. Not when he signed the death certificate. Not even when his mother boarded her plane. But in that moment, something inside him cracked open. "I hate him," he whispered. "I hate that he left like that." Charlotte didn't respond. She just kept dancing, turning her grief into grace, her silence into sanctuary. "I think I'm going crazy." She stopped, walked to him, sat beside him on the cold hardwood floor, and gently rested her head on his shoulder. "You're not," she said. "You're just feeling everything he taught you to bury." They stayed there for hours. At some point he fell asleep with his head in her lap. She stroked his hair like a child's, like someone who'd finally allowed himself to fall apart. That night became sacred. They never spoke of it again, not directly. But something shifted permanently. Their friendship, once playful and bright, now carried the depth of a shared scar, and scars had a way of binding people more tightly than love songs ever could. In the months that followed, Lucas began to change. He became sharper, quieter, but not cold, just more selective. He finished high school early, applied to universities across the country, and began working behind the scenes in his father's company. At every step, Charlotte was his anchor. She proofread his college essays, helped him rehearse interviews, reminded him to eat, to rest, to breathe. But she, too, was changing. Her dancing became more intense, not in showmanship, but in feeling. Her teachers noticed it. Her grandmother, now struggling with arthritis, watched from the corner of the studio with proud, tear-filled eyes as Charlotte danced pain into poetry. She was accepted into the Pacific Dance Conservatory with full scholarship, an honor few ever achieved. They both knew what was coming. Their paths, once intertwined, were now splitting. The night before Lucas left for New York, they sat on the old dock near the harbor, the same place they'd shared so many of their childhood afternoons. The moon shimmered on the water, Charlotte dangled her feet over the edge, her point shoes hanging by their ribbons from her shoulder. Lucas sat beside her, hands in his lap, staring into the black waves. "I don't want to go," he said. "I know, but I have to." "I know that too." Silence. "You've always been the only person I trusted," he added, voice low. "You still are." Charlotte looked over, heart aching. She had rehearsed a goodbye, something composed, something poetic. But instead, she leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "You're going to build something great, Lucas. But don't let it build walls around you. Don't forget who you are beneath the title." He didn't answer. But the way his hand found hers, quiet, firm, said everything. They didn't kiss, didn't confess. But as they sat there in the dark, heartbeats steady and side by side, a different kind of love settled between them. The kind born not from sparks, but from ashes. The kind that doesn't announce itself but waits, patiently, quietly, for the right season to bloom. And as the tide rolled in, carrying with it a breeze full of salt and memory, Charlotte had no idea that one day, years later, that same boy would come back into her life and ask her to carry a piece of him forever. They stood on opposite ends of the country. Charlotte boarded a westbound flight to Los Angeles, with her dreams stitched tightly into a duffel bag and her grandmother's locket tucked against her chest. Lucas went east to New York City, his carry-on filled with cufflinks, strategy books, and the weight of his father's legacy resting invisibly on his shoulders. Their goodbye had been quiet. No grand gestures, no drama. Just a long embrace at the train station, surrounded by strangers rushing past, as if the universe was trying to move them along faster than they were ready for. "Don't disappear," he whispered into her hair. "I won't," she promised, though her voice trembled. Then they let go, slowly, painfully, and walked away without looking back. Because if either of them turned around, they might never have left. The first months were full of noise. Charlotte dove headfirst into the world of dance, intense rehearsals, auditions, theory classes, and sleepless nights that pushed her body and spirit to their limits. The conservatory was demanding, but it was everything she'd ever wanted. Wooden floors that seemed to breathe beneath her feet. Mirrors that didn't just reflect her image, but forced her to confront herself. Teachers who expected not just perfection, but passion. Every movement mattered. Every breath was choreographed. Yet even in her most radiant moments, center stage, spotlight sharp on her, part of her heart felt dimmed. As if the part of her that laughed freely, that made paper boats and shared old records, had stayed behind in port view. She emailed Lucas almost every night. Long letters written in the glow of her desk lamp, filled with stories of aching calves, new friendships, impossible teachers, and small wins that only someone like him would celebrate. She sent him photos of her in rehearsal, videos of sunsets on Venice Beach, and snippets of poems that reminded her of their childhood walks by the water. Lucas, in turn, responded with emails that were equally layered. He spoke of endless business classes, of mentors who didn't see him, of rooms full of ambition but empty of soul. He described New York as electric, but lonely. His days were structured, efficient, and suffocating. Everyone saw him as Edward Bennett's son. No one asked about Lucas, except her. Their connection evolved through the written word. Without physical presence, their letters carried weight, emotion, intimacy. They were no longer just best friends. They were lifelines, emotional mirrors, safe places in the middle of new, uncertain worlds. But time has a way of testing even the deepest roots. By the second year, the messages came slower. Charlotte's schedule tightened with performances and travel. Lucas took on internships, board meetings, networking events. Their conversations shifted, from paragraphs to sentences, from dreams to updates, from always to sometimes. Neither of them wanted the silence, but neither of them fought it hard enough either. One night, Charlotte stared at her inbox, hovering over a half-written reply to Lucas's last message. He'd asked about a new piece she was choreographing, but something about the way he phrased it felt distant, formal, like he was trying not to intrude. She closed the laptop without finishing the email. Across the country, Lucas did the same. Instead of replying to Charlotte's photo from a beach performance in Santa Monica, he stared at it for 20 minutes, zooming in on her smile, the sunlit strands of her hair, the way her hands still moved like music. He saved the photo, but he didn't write back. They didn't drift because they stopped caring. They drifted because life had pulled them into different currents, and neither had learned yet how to swim against the tide. Still, the connection didn't die. It went quiet, like an ember under ash, still glowing, just waiting for breath. Lucas kept her number saved as C-Star. She had his listed as Atlas, because he always carried more than he let on. Years passed. Charlotte graduated top of her class, received an offer to tour with a renowned contemporary dance company in Europe. But during a rehearsal in Milan, a sharp pain in her right knee brought her to the ground. Torn ligament. Career ending, they said. Surgery followed. Then months of rehab. Her world, once built on motion and grace, slowed into stillness. She returned to Portview after a decade away, not in triumph but in retreat. Her grandmother had passed 2 years prior. The apartment above the florist's shop stood empty, filled with dust, old records and echoes of laughter. Charlotte moved back in with a limp and a heavy heart, unsure of what came next. She opened a small studio, teaching dance therapy to children with disabilities and elderly women seeking to reclaim their bodies. It wasn't the stage, but it was healing. Meanwhile, Lucas climbed faster than even his mentors expected. By 30, he was named CEO of Bennett Logistics, the youngest in the company's history. He wore custom suits, traveled by private jet, signed deals with the kind of people who shook hands while hiding knives. But he hated mirrors, because every time he looked into one, he saw the ghost of a boy who once dreamed of nothing more than sailing maps and quiet company. He heard about Charlotte's injury from a former teacher. Her return to Portview spread through the grapevine. A name dropped in passing, a photo from a local paper showing her at a children's recital, and something in him ignited. He didn't wait. He booked a flight, rented a car, drove down the familiar coastline, past every memory embedded in that stretch of road. The trees, the lighthouse, the bench outside the library. He parked in front of her studio and watched. Through the glass, he saw her, not performing but guiding, a little girl in leg braces learning to feel music with her arms. Charlotte knelt beside her, patient, radiant, full of grace that no injury could touch. Lucas felt something break, and something else begin. It had been years, nearly a decade, but in that moment, he wasn't the CEO, and she wasn't the fallen dancer. They were just two souls who had never truly left each other. And as he opened the car door and stepped into the cold Portview air, one thought pulsed louder than all the years of silence between them. It's time. Portview had not changed. The same salty breeze curled through its narrow streets. The same fishermen stood near the docks at sunrise. The same gulls cried overhead like clockwork. But when Lucas stepped onto the sidewalk in front of Charlotte's studio, it felt like the whole town held its breath. Through the wide front window, he saw her, hair tied back in a low bun, wearing soft grey leggings and an oversized sweater. Charlotte moved with the careful, precise grace of someone who knew both power and pain. She was kneeling beside a young boy who couldn't walk without assistance, guiding his hands to feel the rhythm of the music playing in the background. Her voice was low, soft, full of patience. She hadn't seen him yet. Lucas stood there for a full minute, unable to move. He didn't know what had stopped him: fear, guilt, or the sheer weight of everything unsaid. He had prepared so many speeches, drafted a dozen versions of how this might go. But now all words vanished, and all that remained was this: she was here. When she finally turned and saw him, she didn't smile. She froze. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes locking on his with a mixture of disbelief and something deeper, something that trembled beneath the surface like a note held too long. Lucas lifted his hand in a small wave, as if unsure whether he had permission to exist in her world again. She excused herself from the room, stepped into the hallway and opened the door to the front lobby. The bell chimed above her, a sound so ordinary, yet in that moment it cracked something open inside them both. "Lucas," she said, her voice caught between breath and memory. "Hi, Char," the nickname again, like a heartbeat returning after a long pause. They stood facing each other, inches apart, surrounded by silence and the faint hum of a distant violin track. "How long have you been back in town?" she asked. "A few hours." She crossed her arms, trying to steady her emotions. "And you came here first?" "Of course I did." There was so much between them. Years of absence, letters unsent, words left behind. But neither of them mentioned it. Instead, Charlotte gestured toward the small cafe next door. "Coffee?" He nodded. "Please." They sat at the same table they had as teenagers, tucked into a corner with a view of the harbor. 2 cups of black coffee steamed between them. Outside, the sun began its descent, painting the sky with strokes of tangerine and lilac. Charlotte stirred her cup, but didn't drink. "Why are you here, Lucas? Really?" He didn't hesitate. "I want to have a child." Her spoon clinked against the cup. Slowly, she looked up. "I'm sorry? I want to become a father," he said gently. "And I want it to be with you." The air between them turned dense, like fog. Charlotte sat still, eyes searching his face for a sign that this was some sort of metaphor, a warm-up to something else. But Lucas was calm, unshaken. "Why me?" she asked after a beat. He smiled faintly. "Because when I think about the kind of parent I want to be, I see you. I remember the girl who stayed when my whole world collapsed, the woman who could still find grace in the middle of pain. You're the only person I've ever known who makes love feel safe." She laughed, but it wasn't cruel, just disbelieving. "Lucas, I don't even have a husband. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment above a florist. I limp." He leaned in, eyes soft. "You think I care about any of that?" Her heart pounded. "I'm not asking you to raise a child alone. I'm not asking for a donation or a contract. I'm asking to build something. Together, not a traditional family, not a fairy tale, but something real, honest." Charlotte shook her head slowly. "We haven't spoken in years, but that didn't change what we are." She looked away, lips pressed tightly, the old ache returning. "You don't want a romantic relationship. I want a soul-level partnership," he said. "Whatever that becomes, we can shape it together. But I know I don't want to do this with anyone else." She exhaled sharply. "Lucas, I've never even been with someone. I've never—" "I know," he interrupted gently. "And I would never ask you to cross that boundary unless it was something you wanted." His words landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples in places she had long kept untouched. "And why now?" she whispered. "Why not 5 years ago? Or 10? "Because for the first time in my life I'm not running," he replied. "Not from grief, not from expectation. I've done everything the world told me to do, built the empire, became the man my father wasn't, and none of it means anything without someone who sees me." A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. "Why didn't you come sooner?" she asked, barely audible. "Because I was afraid you'd already forgotten how much I needed you." She covered her mouth with one hand, trying to contain the sob that rose unexpectedly. He reached across the table and gently took her free hand, his touch grounding her like an anchor in a storm. "I'm not offering a fantasy," he said. "Just a chance. A beginning. On your terms." Charlotte looked down at their hands, hers, delicate, trembling, his, warm, steady, and for a moment the past folded into the present. The boy who had once cried in her lap and the girl who had once danced to heal him were no longer lost to time. They were here, and the future, uncertain, fragile, maybe even extraordinary, was suddenly possible. But was she ready? Was she brave enough to choose something that wasn't perfect but true? Charlotte didn't answer. Not yet. But something had shifted in her silence. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting their faces in golden shadow, one thing became clear. Whatever decision she made next would change both of their lives forever. Charlotte didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the shadows from her bedroom window stretching across the walls like long, silent questions. Outside, the quiet hum of Portview settled into its midnight hush, but inside her everything was loud, thoughts ricocheting like dancers out of rhythm. A child, with Lucas, not out of love, not out of obligation, but out of trust, shared history, and something even deeper. A bond that defied conventional definition. She had spent her entire life choosing the safe route. She had waited for the kind of love that made sense, that fit the pages of romance novels and classic ballets, slow-burning, grand, declared with flowers and crescendos. But now, a new question haunted her. What if the most genuine form of love wasn't loud, but rooted? She rose just after dawn, unable to bear the weight of her own silence. Wrapped in a wool coat and scarf, she walked through the early streets of Portview, her breath turning to mist in the cold morning air. There was only one person she could talk to, Margaret Reynolds, her grandmother's oldest friend and once her fiercest ballet mentor, a woman known equally for her discipline and her intuition. She had taught Charlotte how to leap without looking down, how to breathe through pain, and how to recognize when fear was masquerading as practicality. Margaret lived in a cozy yellow house on the edge of town, with ivy climbing the walls and a garden that always seemed to be in bloom, even when the seasons said otherwise. She opened the door before Charlotte even knocked. "You look like you've swallowed a storm," she said, stepping aside to let her in. Charlotte laughed softly, grateful. Something like that. Inside, the house smelled of sage and old books. A kettle was already hissing on the stove. They sat in the sunroom, wrapped in quilts, surrounded by plants and quiet warmth. Charlotte hesitated before speaking. Lucas came back. Margaret raised a brow. "The Sea Prince?" She nodded. "He asked me to have a child with him." Margaret blinked slowly but didn't flinch. "Marriage?" "No." "Romance?" "Not exactly. He says it's about trust, about building something real, something rooted." The older woman leaned back, sipping her tea. "And how do you feel?" Charlotte exhaled, terrified, confused, a little seen, and maybe something else I can't name. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stretch, as if listening for something deeper. "You know," she said finally, "when your grandmother decided to keep your mother, she was 17, alone, abandoned. Everyone told her to walk away. But she didn't. She chose with her heart, not because it made sense, but because it made her feel." Charlotte looked down, fingering the edge of her mug. "He's not asking for a romance," she said. "He's asking for partnership, for family. And he's choosing me not because I'm perfect, but because I've been there, through everything." Margaret nodded. "So, what's stopping you?" Charlotte didn't answer right away. "I guess I'm afraid of losing what we have," she said softly, "of stepping into something irreversible, of not being enough." "You're afraid," Margaret replied gently, "because for the first time what's being offered isn't about fairy tales. It's about truth, and truth always demands courage." Charlotte blinked, holding back tears. "I never planned on being a mother," she whispered. "Plans are overrated," the woman smiled. "Ask the wind, ask the sea." They sat in silence again. Margaret reached over and gently held her hand. "You already know what you want, Charlotte. You're just scared it won't look like the picture you painted in your head." Charlotte's eyes met hers, full of emotion. "Then change the picture," Margaret said. "Paint something new, something that makes your heart grow, not shrink." That phrase echoed. "Makes your heart grow, not shrink." It was something her grandmother used to say, when Charlotte was 5 and afraid to perform, when she was 10 and missed her mother, when she was 18 and boarding a plane alone. She hadn't thought of it in years, and now it came back like a key. Later that day, Charlotte walked through the studio alone. The mirrors reflected more than her body. They reflected her choices, her past, her resilience. She looked at herself not as a dancer, not as a teacher, but as a woman standing on the edge of something unknown. She thought of Lucas, of his vulnerability, of the way he had looked at her, not with desperation, but with reverence, like someone finally asking not for permission, but for partnership. Could she do this? Could she open her life, her body, her heart to something so unstructured? She sat on the floor of the studio, letting the late afternoon light spill across her skin. She closed her eyes and listened, not to music but to the rhythm of her own breath. And somewhere deep within the quiet, she felt it. Not certainty, but peace. And perhaps that was all she needed. Not a perfect plan. Just the courage to take the next step. Lucas arrived at the studio in the late afternoon. He didn't know if she would respond that day or that week. He hadn't pushed. Since their conversation at the cafe, he had maintained silence. A respectful silence, but heavy with expectation, not out of certainty but out of hope. When he entered, the lights were low. The soft sound of an instrumental piano filled the space like a slow breath. Charlotte stood in the center of the room, eyes closed, her arms relaxed at her sides. Lucas didn't say a word. He just watched. The woman in front of him was no longer the girl who danced by the harbor. She was more contained, more grounded, but also more whole. Pain had sculpted her, not destroyed her, and in that moment he knew. Whatever answer came, it would be a truth. Charlotte opened her eyes and saw him. "You came," she said. "I would have come every day," he replied. "If that's what you needed." She smiled faintly, but there was something solemn in her gaze. She walked toward him slowly, as if crossing an invisible bridge. "Lucas," she began, "I've thought a lot about what you asked me. I spoke with my mentor. I turned over memories. I rewrote my own story in my head." He nodded, not interrupting. "And I realized that what scares me isn't the child, not the living together, not even what might change between us." She stopped right in front of him. "What scares me," she continued, "is giving something so intimate to someone, without knowing if what we're building has firm ground." Lucas swallowed. "I understand." "Then I accept." He blinked. "You—" "Yes," she said, her voice clear, "but under 3 conditions." A smile of surprise and relief formed on his lips. "What are they?" Charlotte took a deep breath, keeping her eyes fixed on his. "First," she said, "this has to be a true partnership. No control, no impositions. We are 2 adults making a choice together, with mutual respect and space for each of us." He nodded. "Completely fair." "Second," she continued, "our friendship must be protected. Even if feelings arise, even if everything changes, what we've always been to each other must remain sacred." Lucas looked at her as if he saw a cathedral of memories between them. "That's what matters most to me." Charlotte took a step closer. "And lastly," she said, her voice lower, "everything we do must be done with love." She saw his expression change, not to romance, but to something more raw, more profound. "I'm not saying you have to love me now, or that I love you this way at this moment, but what we're going to create needs to come from the cleanest, truest place inside of us, even if it's not a fairy tale love, even if it doesn't turn into a romance. It has to be a love that cares." Lucas took a deep breath. "I couldn't have asked for more than that." She smiled, but her eyes were misty. "This decision didn't come on impulse," she said. "It comes from what you've always represented to me, since that day on the bench at the library. You saved me more times than you realize, Char." She laughed softly. "You only called me that when you needed courage." He took her hands in his. They were smaller than he remembered, but so firm, so determined. "I accept your conditions," he said. "All of them." "With gratitude." She looked at him for a long time, as if she wanted to hold that image. The boy who survived pain, the man who learned to ask with humility. "Then let's begin," she said. In the following weeks, they dove into the preparations together. Medical appointments, exams, therapies. It wasn't a romantic process, but it was intimate, deep, full of honest conversations and silences that didn't hurt. Lucas was present at every step, not as someone fulfilling an obligation, but as someone honoring a pact. He listened to her with attention, held her hand during exams, took notes at consultations, filled her fridge with organic fruits and ginger tea, as if every detail was part of something sacred. Charlotte, in turn, opened her world. She allowed him to know her daily rituals, her quirks, her fears. She told him about the scar on her knee, about the pain of leaving the stage, about the sense of uselessness she carried for months, until she found meaning in teaching children who danced with their hearts, not their bodies. "You were never useless," Lucas said one night as they had soup on her couch. "You were just learning to dance differently." It was in those moments that something new began to form between them. It wasn't passion, it was tenderness. It was the building of a love without hurry, a safe space where each one could breathe. They started meeting outside the medical schedule, short walks along the shore, long conversations under the evening sky, a movie watched in silence, with their hands almost touching but without rushing. Charlotte began to see Lucas as a whole, the man who ran a global company with firmness, and who cried listening to Nina Simone on cold nights. The boy who lost his father to the sea, and who now learned to care for himself. And Lucas began to see Charlotte as more than a sweet memory of the past. She was strength in the form of calm. She was poetry, written with discipline. She was love that didn't demand anything, but required everything that was real. One night after a long day of exams, they were sitting on the old bench near the lighthouse, the same one where she used to wait for the school bus. The wind messed up their hair. The moon reflected on the waves like promises. Charlotte rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you still want to be a father?" she asked. "More than ever," he said. She closed her eyes. "Then let's try in the next fertile window." Lucas didn't answer, but she felt, in the way he hugged her, that in that moment something bigger than both of them had begun to be born. Not a child yet, but a new kind of faith. And like everything that begins with courage, no one knew exactly where it would lead. But for the first time, Charlotte didn't need certainty. She only needed the truth they were building, day by day, touch by touch. They didn't call it dating. There were no labels, no promises, just the companionship, honest, intimate, built around a decision that ironically was less about the child they might have, and more about what they were becoming to each other. The fertilization process, with its consultations, charts, exams, and dates, ended up serving as a kind of emotional map. With every step, they found themselves forced to talk about the body, about boundaries, about expectations, and the more they exposed themselves, the more the formality dissolved. The space between them began to shrink. Charlotte, who for so many years had guarded her intimacy like a treasure, began to relax in his presence. She would come down for breakfast in her pajamas. She let him see her with wet hair, without makeup, laughing out loud at her own clumsiness. Lucas, in turn, allowed himself to slow down. He started spending more time in Portview, attending dance therapy classes, helping with the studio tasks, bringing homemade cakes, always with awkward excuses, like testing my ability to follow recipes on YouTube. They hadn't planned for this, but slowly they began to sleep on the same couch, side by side, falling asleep during marathons of old movies. They started to share silence, the kind of silence that only happens between people who truly know each other. One afternoon, Charlotte came back from the studio exhausted, with her ankles throbbing. Lucas, seeing her, kneeled down without saying anything and began to gently massage her feet. Neither of them spoke. But in that touch, respectful, attentive, full of care, something changed. It wasn't desire. It was reverence. That night, Charlotte didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the warmth of his touch still present on her feet. They were approaching something dangerous, or maybe something necessary. Then came the rain. One of those long nights when the water falls as if the sky needed to cry everything at once. Charlotte had already finished the activities at the studio. She was at home, wrapped in a blanket on the couch, with a book in her lap and tea in her hands. Lucas arrived, soaked. He had left for a meeting in another city, but decided to return earlier than planned. "Why didn't you stay at the hotel?" she asked. He took off his coat, shrugging his shoulders. "Because no bed makes me sleep if it's not near you." She didn't answer. He approached slowly, sitting beside her. His hair was wet, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes tired. But there was something in his tone, a simplicity that cut through any protection she still tried to maintain. Charlotte took a towel and began to dry his hair carefully. Her movements were soft, almost maternal, but her eyes told a different story. When she finished, they were face to face. Silence, short breaths, only the sound of the rain hammering the roof. "Are you still afraid of me?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. She took a moment to answer. "No." "Are you afraid of us?" Charlotte hesitated. "It's not fear. It's reverence. Like, touching this means entering a temple." Lucas extended his hand, touching her face with his wet fingers. "Then enter," he said. with respect, with everything. She closed her eyes, allowed herself to lean in. It was the first kiss, nothing rehearsed, nothing technical, just two worlds colliding at the right time. The kiss lasted longer than she expected, but not because of intensity, because of care, as if he wanted to memorize every second. And she, too. When they pulled apart, she whispered, "This changes everything, doesn't it?" Lucas answered with another question. "Do you regret it?" Charlotte shook her head. "No. I just wonder if we're still on the right path. Maybe there's no right path. Maybe we just need to choose to keep walking, even without knowing where it will lead." She hugged him, for the first time, with her whole body. And that night, without haste, without a script, she surrendered to him. Not as someone losing something, but as someone sharing. Lucas touched her gently, explored every movement with respect, asked if everything was okay, stopped when he sensed hesitation, followed her eyes with his, and when their bodies finally united, it wasn't pleasure that took over. It was silence. The kind of silence that comes when two souls recognize each other without needing to explain themselves. Afterward, they lay side by side. Charlotte cried silently. Lucas wrapped his arms around her and whispered, "Thank you." She didn't answer, but he felt her heart beating strongly against his chest. There were no promises that night, no guarantees. But there was something more important, the certainty that they were finally in the same place. And in that room, where the rain still fell steadily outside, something began to be born. Not just a new stage of the agreement between them, but maybe, who knows, a love that no longer knew if it was friendship, partnership, or passion. Just love. Pure, simple, inevitable. The morning after their first night together, Charlotte woke up before Lucas. She lay still for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath, feeling the weight of his arm around her waist. A soft light peeked through the curtains, casting golden stripes across his bare shoulder. Everything about the moment felt suspended, like a note held just before the chord resolves. She turned slightly to face him. His expression was peaceful, softer than she'd ever seen. For a man who spent his life calculating risk and commanding boardrooms, sleep stripped him down to something raw, something real. She brushed her fingers along his jaw, then slipped quietly out of bed. In the bathroom, she caught her reflection in the mirror. Her hair was messy. Her cheeks still held the flush of last night, but it was the look in her eyes that made her pause. Not regret, not even doubt, just a quiet, trembling hope. It was the first time in years that she allowed herself to want something without guilt. The following week, they met with their fertility specialist, a calm, gentle woman named Dr. Patel, who had the kind of voice that made you feel like everything might be okay, even when it wasn't. The first attempt would be scheduled around Charlotte's next ovulation cycle. Tests were run, hormone levels tracked. Lucas sat beside her at every appointment, never checking his phone, never rushing. Just there. They began to navigate the strange rhythm of trying to conceive. It wasn't just about biology. It became a dance of timing and tenderness, of medical protocols and emotional undercurrents. Charlotte kept a journal, not of the science, but of the feelings. She wrote about how strange it was to measure something so intimate, how surreal it felt to inject hormones into her own body, while also trying to hold space for what might never come. Lucas started making her smoothies every morning. He claimed they were optimizing cellular alignment, but she knew he was just trying to make her laugh and to give her something small, steady, and full of care. They didn't talk about love, not directly, but it was everywhere. In the way he rubbed her back during hormone crashes, in the way she waited for him to arrive before reading her test results, in the way they chose again and again to stay. Then came the first procedure. It was clinical, quiet, no drama, just white walls and gloved hands, and the beep of a monitor that marked the passing of time. Charlotte held Lucas's hand the entire time. He whispered to her about the first ship he ever built as a child, how he always believed the sea could carry you if you trusted it, even when you couldn't see the shore. They went home and waited. 2 weeks later, the test was negative. Charlotte sat on the edge of the bathtub, the plastic stick in her hands, her heart sinking before her mind could catch up. Lucas found her there, eyes blank, not crying, just still. He knelt beside her, took the test, set it aside and wrapped his arms around her. "We tried," he whispered. "I really thought—" She started, then stopped. "I know. It's stupid to be this upset after just one try." "It's not stupid," he said. "You opened your heart, that's never stupid." They lay on the bathroom floor for hours, the tiles cold beneath them. Neither moved, neither tried to fix it. They just stayed. A few days later, Charlotte smiled again, not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain had softened into something shared, and shared pain is lighter. The second attempt wasn't planned. They had agreed to pause, to give it a month, let her body rest, let their hearts breathe. But one rainy afternoon, they found themselves in her kitchen, soaked and laughing after getting caught without umbrellas. She was wearing one of his sweaters. He was barefoot, cooking pasta with a kind of clumsy reverence. She hugged him from behind. He turned around. And the moment simply happened. No talk of cycles, no plan, just presence, just them. The next morning, she woke with a quiet flutter in her chest, something between disbelief and wonder. And weeks later, in a tiny room with soft lighting and a heartbeat monitor, Dr. Patel smiled. "You're pregnant." Charlotte couldn't speak. Lucas gripped her hand as if to hold the entire world steady. A flicker on the screen. A heartbeat. Not loud, but there. Alive. She turned to him, eyes flooded. "I don't even know what to say." He leaned in close, forehead to hers. "Say nothing," he whispered. "Just feel it." And so she did. All of it. The fear, the joy, the awe. And somewhere inside that silent flood, she realized something that had been building all along. They hadn't just created life. They were finally learning how to live it. Together. It didn't take long for the whispers to begin. At first it was subtle. A sideways glance in the grocery store. A pause in conversation when Charlotte entered the local bakery. Women who once exchanged recipes with her now smiled too tightly. Men stared a beat too long. Portview was small. Small towns didn't ask. They assumed. The news that Charlotte Hayes, the quiet dance teacher, was pregnant and not married would have been enough to stir gossip. But the fact that the father was Lucas Bennett, the town's most powerful native son, turned curiosity into spectacle. Some said she was calculating. Others called her naive. A few said worse. "Of course he chose her," someone muttered in line at the pharmacy. "She's safe, easy to control." "I heard she planned it," another voice said. "Trapped him with the baby." It wasn't just talk, it was the shift in energy, in how people began to define her by the man standing beside her. It stung, more than she wanted to admit. Charlotte had spent her entire life carving her own path, dancing her truth across uneven floors, healing her students with touch and patience, rebuilding her body after injury, and saying yes to a future that terrified her, not out of ambition, but out of love. Now they were reducing her to a strategy. Lucas noticed. Of course he did. He offered to speak publicly, a press statement, an interview, even a social post. But she refused. "This isn't your fight," she said. "It's mine." And it was. Not just about the gossip, but about her own identity. She had spent years being known as his friend, then as his partner, now as the mother of his child. But who was she apart from that? One Sunday afternoon she sat alone in the studio, surrounded by mirrors and silence. Her belly was beginning to show, small and delicate, a quiet announcement of the life growing inside her. She watched herself stretch in the reflection, noting how her body had changed, how her breath moved differently, how her center of gravity shifted, not weaker, just different. That night, she opened her laptop and submitted an application to the Chicago Institute of Movement Therapy, a weekend certification program in therapeutic dance, a prestigious, highly selective course she had once only dreamed of attempting. She didn't ask Lucas for permission, she simply told him at dinner. "I applied." He paused, fork midair. "To what?" "The movement therapy program in Chicago. If I'm accepted, I'll go every weekend, even while pregnant." Lucas blinked. You'll be traveling alone? Yes. He set the fork down. Are you sure that's safe? I'm sure it's right. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Charlotte. I'm not doing it for them, she said. I'm doing it for me. Because before I was your partner or this baby's mother, I was someone who moved the world with my body. And I still am. Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, he smiled. There she is, he said. The woman who never asked for permission to be powerful. She was accepted. Every Saturday morning she boarded the early train to Chicago, belly growing, notebooks packed, resolve solid. The program was intense, intellectual, physical. She found herself surrounded by other women, many of them mothers, artists, survivors, each reclaiming movement in their own way. She cried during the first class, not from exhaustion, but recognition. She wasn't alone in this. Each weekend she returned to Portview with new ideas, new confidence, a deeper sense of self. She began implementing what she learned with her students, introduced trauma-informed techniques, brought music therapy into her sessions, taught elderly women how to find freedom in stillness. People noticed, not just the critics, the right people. She received an invitation to speak at a regional dance educators conference, was offered a column in a therapeutic arts magazine. Even the mayor of Portview attended one of her open classes and publicly praised her work. The whispers began to fade, and in their place, something else bloomed. Respect. Not because she was attached to Lucas, but because she had refused to disappear inside him. Lucas watched her glow from the sidelines, proud, silent, deeply aware that her journey was never meant to orbit him. He was not the sun in this story. She was. One evening, she stood in front of the studio mirrors again, now visibly pregnant, guiding a class of women through a meditation in motion. The lights were low, the music soft. Each woman moved with her own rhythm, each gesture an act of reclaiming space. Charlotte closed her eyes. She felt the baby move, and in that small, fluttering moment, she realized something she had never dared to believe. She wasn't becoming someone new. She was finally becoming fully herself, with or without applause, with or without approval, and in that truth she had never felt more free. The offer came on a crisp autumn morning. Charlotte had just finished her weekend course in Chicago when the program director pulled her aside. A new position was opening, lead instructor in their therapeutic movement initiative. It meant designing curriculum, mentoring young dancers, working with physicians and psychologists. It was everything Charlotte had quietly dreamed of, but never believed she would be offered. She sat on a bench outside Union Station, with the envelope in her lap, watching the city move in fast forward, taxis honking, strangers in coats brushing past, the skyline glittering like ambition. Chicago was alive in a way Portview never could be, and for the first time Charlotte didn't feel overwhelmed by it. She felt ready. But then came the real question. Could she leave everything behind? The studio, her students, the apartment above the florist's shop, the porch light Lucas always turned on before she got home, the rhythm they'd built together, quiet and tender, piece by piece. That night, she returned to Portview carrying the letter in her coat pocket like a secret. Lucas was waiting for her in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, humming to the jazz playing on the record player. He looked up when she walked in, smiled, but the smile faded when he saw her expression. "You're quiet," he said. "I got an offer," she said, setting the envelope on the table between them. He dried his hands and sat, read the letter slowly, then looked up. "This is everything you've worked for." Charlotte's voice was barely above a whisper. "It would mean moving." He didn't flinch. "And I'd be taking our baby with me." He was quiet for a long time. Charlotte stood there, not breathing, preparing herself for resistance. A plea to stay, a reminder of everything they'd built. But Lucas didn't say any of that. He just nodded. "I'll go with you." Her throat tightened. "What?" "I'll move to Chicago with you," he said simply. "We'll raise our child there. Together." Tears welled up in her eyes before she could stop them. "I never asked you to." "I know," he said, reaching for her hand, "but I'm not going to ask you to shrink just so I don't have to grow." She sat down beside him, hands shaking. "I don't want to be the reason you sacrifice your life," she whispered. He looked at her then, eyes full of something deeper than anything he'd ever said. "You were the reason I started living." And that's when Charlotte knew. This wasn't about logistics. This was about love, the kind that moves, adapts, sacrifices and builds without demanding anything in return. A week later, they drove back to Chicago together. They explored neighborhoods, toured apartments, debated the pros and cons of proximity to parks and clinics and schools. It felt surreal, like a life neither of them had dared to imagine was finally beginning to take shape. One afternoon, Lucas asked if they could stop by Lakeview, a quiet neighborhood with wide sidewalks and a lakefront path lined with tall, whispering trees. Charlotte agreed. They walked slowly, her hand resting on her round belly, the wind tangling her scarf. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, painting the lake in shades of rose and indigo. They stopped near a bench overlooking the water. "I used to come here," Lucas said, "during my first year in New York. I'd drive to the water, just to remember what it felt like to breathe." Charlotte looked up at him. "Why did you bring me here?" But Lucas didn't answer with words. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Her breath caught. He didn't kneel. He didn't make a speech. He simply opened it. Inside was a delicate ring, silver band with a single emerald set in the center. Not a diamond, not flashy, just green, like the sea, like the color of home. Charlotte covered her mouth, tears already streaming down her cheeks. "I don't want to rush you," he said quietly. "This isn't a condition, it's not about tradition, I just—" He paused, voice trembling. "I want to build a life with you, and I want our child to grow up knowing that their parents chose each other, not because they had to, but because they wanted to." Over and over again, Charlotte reached out and took the box. She stared at the ring for a long moment, then slipped it onto her finger and whispered, "Yes." Not loud, not grand, just true. The wind picked up around them, stirring the leaves, carrying away everything that had ever made her doubt this moment. They held each other on the bench, the lake stretching endlessly before them, the future wide and wild and unpromised. But theirs. 2 months later, they married in a small ceremony at the Portview Lighthouse. No aisle, no guests in gowns, just a few close friends, a string quartet, the sea behind them, and the kind of silence that makes everything sacred. Charlotte wore a simple cream dress, her belly pronounced beneath the fabric. Lucas wore a navy blue suit with salt in his hair and a look in his eyes that spoke louder than vows. They exchanged words written in private, not for performance, but for presence. And when they kissed, slow, certain, full of everything they had once feared, the ocean roared behind them as if to say, "Yes, you've arrived." The night Lorenzo decided to arrive, the world was still. It wasn't dramatic, no water breaking in public or frantic drive to the hospital. Just Charlotte waking at 2:13 a.m. with a deep, rhythmic ache, a knowing in her bones that something sacred was beginning. She sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, breathing through it, hands on her swollen belly. The apartment was dim, the city humming quietly beyond the windows. Lucas stirred beside her, sensing the shift before she even touched him. "Is it time?" he whispered. She nodded. "I think he's ready." Lucas didn't panic. He rose calmly, helped her into the robe they'd packed weeks ago, and held her hand as they stepped into the early Chicago morning, mist rising from the pavement, the streetlights blinking like soft beacons. The hospital was quiet. Everything moved in slow waves, intake forms, nurses with warm voices, monitors beeping steadily. Charlotte labored for hours, her breath becoming music, her pain sacred. Lucas never left her side. He read poems between contractions, played Miles Davis from his phone, held her hand as if it was the only anchor left in the world. And then, after a long silence and a single piercing cry, he was there. Lorenzo Bennett. Tiny. Perfect. His skin flushed and warm, his cries immediate and strong, as if he had something urgent to say to the world. Charlotte held him first. She stared into his scrunched little face and sobbed, not from pain, but from the kind of love that splits you wide open, the kind that erases every doubt and makes space for everything else that matters. Lucas stood beside her, hand trembling on her shoulder, eyes glazed with unshed tears. "He's here," Charlotte whispered, pressing her lips to the baby's head. Lucas leaned down, resting his forehead against both of them. "We did it," he said. But Charlotte shook her head. "We're just beginning." The first weeks were a blur of soft cries, sleepless nights, and learning everything from scratch. Charlotte, ever graceful, adapted in quiet determination. She learned how to nurse, to soothe, to swaddle. Lucas, always composed in business, found himself flustered by diapers and bottle temperatures, yet never once gave up. He held Lorenzo during the 3 a.m. feedings, whispered stories about sea voyages and forgotten cities. He wore him in a sling as he took Zoom calls, paced with him through the hallways, hummed lullabies that had no lyrics, but carried centuries of tenderness. And every time Charlotte watched him, she fell in love again. Differently, deeper, not with the man she once comforted in grief, but with the father who had learned how to be soft. One evening, about 3 months after the birth, Charlotte stood on the apartment balcony, swaying gently with Lorenzo in her arms. The city stretched before her, alive and glimmering. Inside, Lucas was washing bottles, his sleeves rolled up, a familiar record playing low in the background. She looked down at her son. He blinked up at her, calm and curious, a patch of dark hair curling near his ear. "You changed everything," she whispered. "Not just our lives, but who we are." Behind her, Lucas appeared, wrapping his arms around both of them from behind. His chin rested on her shoulder. His breath warmed her neck. "You regret any of it?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, because the truth was, there were moments she had been terrified. Moments she had doubted her body, her heart, her strength. Moments when the past haunted her. Her mother's absence, her father's early death, her belief that love had to be earned, not simply given. But now, with Lucas's arms around her and their child safe in her embrace, she felt something she'd never dared to name before. "Peace. No," she finally whispered. "Not a second of it." Lucas kissed her cheek. And in that moment, with the city below and the stars above, they stood not just as two people who had made a choice, but as a family, a real one, built from brokenness, held together by trust, strengthened by love. Weeks passed. Lorenzo grew. His laugh came easily, loud and full of mischief. His fingers curled tightly around Lucas's tie. Charlotte's necklace. Anything that connected him to the people who loved him. They took long walks in the park, brought him to Portview to meet the children from Charlotte's old studio, spent slow mornings cooking pancakes and dancing barefoot in the kitchen. One evening, while putting Lorenzo to sleep, Lucas whispered, "Do you think he'll ever understand what it took for us to get here?" Charlotte smiled, watching her son drift off in her arms. "No," she said, "but that's the gift. He doesn't need to. He just needs to feel it." Lucas reached out, touched her face gently. "I think I've loved you since the day you made me sit in the library and write down 5 reasons I was angry." Charlotte laughed, surprised. "You were 12, and dramatic." "I was in pain," he corrected, smiling. She kissed him then, not out of ritual, but because love, their love, had stopped being a question. It had become a rhythm, not loud, but always present. And so the story of Charlotte and Lucas, once shaped by fear, silence, and longing, now lived in the heartbeat of a home filled with lullabies, laughter, and quiet understanding. They didn't need vows to remind them of their commitment. They lived it, every day. And as they stood on the balcony again, a year after that first proposal, holding hands while Lorenzo slept inside, Charlotte turned to Lucas and whispered, "Do you realize what we've built?" Lucas looked at her with the calm, unwavering gaze of someone who finally understood the difference between power and peace. "Yes," he said, "we built love. Some people wait a lifetime to be chosen, but Charlotte didn't wait. She chose first. She chose to trust. She chose to give. And in doing so, she taught him how to love, not with grand gestures, but with presence, with softness, with the courage to build something real, one quiet moment at a time. They didn't start with love, but love found them anyway. Now, as they hold their son in their arms, what once felt impossible has become their truth. Because sometimes the greatest kind of love is the one that begins when you finally stop waiting for permission. And you, would you be brave enough to build a life with someone before love had a name? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening from? Your like helps this channel grow and keep bringing more emotional stories like this one. Share it with someone special.